Hello everybody! Today I'm going to teach you how to apply a method called representation analysis created by Stuart Hall, the founder of cultural studies. Let's start. Please use this method if you choose to critically analyze a cultural artifact. What is a cultural artifact? It could be a movie, a television series, an animation, a cartoon, stand-up comedy, video game, board game, music album, comic book, novel, poem, photo collection, fashion collection, toy art, painting, sculpture, dance choreography, theater play, political speech, news. Well, basically anything that is created and has a meaning, that's a cultural artifact. Usually you can find them in the media. So, to begin with, Stuart Hall created the Circuit of Culture. The Circuit of Culture has 5 parts. They are representation, identity, production, consumption, and regulation. Although all of them can be separated to a certain degree to make it easier to understand, they are interconnected and interdependent. You cannot really study or analyze only one of them separate from the others. The moment or practice one, that's gonna be representation. Representation is kind of similar to critical discourse analysis, and here I'm using the word discourse in the meaning that was established by Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, in the 1970s. It's also similar to another method that is called content analysis, and also to another method called textual analysis. And of course, there are other methods that are congruent with this method. For example, narrative analysis, right? Now, when you are analyzing a cultural artifact through representation, you need to pay attention to 2 parts, in which the second part is much more important. The first part is intended messages, and the second one is unintended, hidden, or subtle messages. Intended messages are the messages that the author of that cultural artifact wanted to convey, what the author wanted the audiences to understand, okay? Their intended meaning. And if you are concerned with what the authors wanted to tell you, you could use the intentional approach. The intentional approach assumes that meanings reflect the author's intention. For example, if you are analyzing a novel, let's say The Hunger Games, you would assume that the writer of this book had a certain intention. Let's say you read interviews or you watch videos with interviews with the writer, and this writer says that her intention was to say that the Hunger Games reflect problems in society such as celebrity culture, neoliberal capitalism, and war. So that was her intention, right? Now, on the other hand, Stuart Hall prefers the constructivist approach. He used to say that the intention of the author does not directly reflect the meanings that are understood by the audience. Sometimes the audience understands something completely different from what the author intended. For example, have you ever said something and then the person who was talking to you understood something completely different from what you meant? Everybody has gone through this experience. So this means that the intentional approach is not enough to understand the meanings behind a cultural artifact. Now, the second part, unintended, hidden, or subtle messages, this part is what you have to focus on. Those are the meanings that the author probably did not want to convey, but these messages are there anyway. Okay? Even though the author did not want to say something intentionally, maybe those messages were there from the beginning. So in this case, you have to use the constructivist approach, in which the author and the audience co-construct meanings through language. It means that it is not only in one direction, in which the script writer, the writer, the director, or any other author of the cultural artifact says something, and that's exactly what the audience will understand. Rather, both the author and the audience have some power in conveying a message and interpreting that message. For you to find those subtle messages, you will need to develop a skill called media literacy. Media literacy is a set of skills that helps you understand cultural artifacts using critical thinking. Okay? So critical thinking skills are essential for you to find those hidden messages. Now, why are there some messages in cultural artifacts that the author did not want to convey? Most of the time, it is because of implicit bias. Those are the biases that are in our unconscious or subconscious, that our brain comes up with those ideas in a split of a second. And so even if it's not our intention to have certain thoughts and feelings, they are there in the back of our minds. If you want to learn more about it, please take the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. These unintended messages also happen because of stereotypes, because of certain images that we have about marginalized groups, about people of color, about women, about queer people, and so on. And also because of prejudice, feelings, emotions that come up in our hearts towards certain groups. For example, feeling pity for girls who are crying, but feeling contempt for boys who are crying because of sexism, because of an oppressive ideal of masculinity that tells children that boys don't cry. Now, for you to better understand how to apply representation, I will use Rachel Griffin's article in which she analyzes a movie called The Help. The Help was a movie that was released in 2011, and the director was Tate Taylor. This movie was very popular, and even today there are a lot of people who think that this movie is perfect. But Rachel Griffin and many other critical scholars do not think so. Why? We're going to see it. So what are the intended messages of this movie? What did the director, the producer, the script writer of this movie wanted to say? So, the movie wanted to say that racism can be solved by good, non-racist white individuals, such as the main character of the movie, Skeeter, who is a young white woman. And that those good white people will save black people from bad, racist white individuals. Okay? So this is the most important message that the movie wants to convey. Another intended message is that a movie is feminist when the main character is a woman. If the lead character is a woman or a girl, therefore the movie will be feminist. Another intended message is to liberate herself from racism, a black woman just has to leave the place where she is oppressed and go somewhere else. So in the last scene of the movie, the character Abilene is fired from a house where she has been working for many years, and then she leaves, and then she walks towards a shiny horizon, and that scene has very beautiful music, very touchy, emotional music, in which the scene tries to evoke hope, right? So as she leaves a very racist house, then probably she will walk towards a better future. However, what are those subtle, hidden messages that the authors did not want to convey but were actually there? First of all, this is a white savior movie. It's the most typical case of a white savior narrative. And the white savior narrative implies that white people save people of color, that white people are active agents of change, whereas people of color are passive victims. So those people of color are not capable of fighting for their own liberation. They just wait for white people to come and save them. Now, this white savior narrative comes from whiteness. Whiteness is a form of racism, that is based on white supremacy. And white supremacy is an ideology that assumes that white people are superior to people of color. The movie ignores Jim Crow laws. It ignores the structural root of racism. Why is it that black women are mistreated in this movie? Is it only because there are certain white individuals who are crazy, who are evil, and mistreat them? Actually, if you look at history, you will see that the entire US society was based on racism. And actually, racism was legal, right? That Jim Crow laws legally approved segregation in the United States of America. The movie also ignores the civil rights movement and people of color's leadership in anti-racist efforts. So in the movie, a good individual, Skeeter, saves black women, when in fact, in real life, the reason why Jim Crow laws are over, the reason why today people of color can enter colleges, the reason why today there are laws that protect people of color from racism, it is because people of color, especially people of color and some white allies, have fought really hard collectively for liberation, right? So racism is structural. It is in the macro level. It is systemic, which means that the root of this problem is not in the micro level, in the individual, personal, psychological level. It is not because of evil individuals. So it cannot be blamed on individuals, and neither can it be solved only by individual efforts, only by expecting that one person, two persons will come and save us all. That's not enough. We have to think about collective efforts against racism and other systemic oppressions. This movie also ignores intersectional feminism. Intersectional feminism is based on the theory and method of intersectionality that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. The movie centers on a white higher class woman. However, in intersectional feminism, we have to center on the bodies and the voices of the most marginalized groups within a group. So, for example, if we want to fight for the rights of women, we should center the voices of women of color, queer women, migrant undocumented women, women with disabilities, and so on. So within the group of women, even though all of us are suffering from misogyny, patriarchy, and sexism, however, because of our other identities, our racial, class, age, and other identities, we suffer from sexism in different ways and in different levels. Okay? So, because the voices of the most marginalized people in a marginalized group are usually ignored, that's exactly why intersectional feminism has to center those voices. This movie also relies on post-racial discourse. Post-racial discourse is the myth that racism is a thing of the past. This story happens in the 1960s, and in the end of the movie, when we see Abilene walking towards the horizon, walking towards the future, we have that good feeling. Oh, it's so good that today we don't have to face this horrible racism anymore. Things are so much better today, right? But the truth is that we still live in an extremely racist society. Racism is present everywhere. So the post-racial discourse tries to say, oh, regardless of race, we are all women. We all support each other. And because of good individuals like Skeeter, today we don't have to go through such horrible racism anymore. But unfortunately, that is not the case in the year 2020. Other subtle messages that Rachel Griffin points out are that this movie is a coming of age story. Coming of age story is a very common narrative form, narrative style, in which the protagonist are not mature enough yet, but they go through a lot of obstacles, and then in the end of the story, they are more mature and they can succeed in life. So this is a coming of age story about Skeeter, the protagonist. In this story, black characters are used to empower the white protagonist to become a confident woman and writer. So in the beginning of the story, Skeeter thinks that she is ugly, that she's not competent enough, and boys do not want to have her as a girlfriend, right? But in the end of the movie, she is a confident woman. She has a new boyfriend and she is very confident to become a journalist. So, all this interaction with black women, with black maids, are just an excuse for Skeeter to grow as a woman and as a professional. Another subtle message is that Abilene's son wanted to be a writer but was killed by white men. So Abilene asks Skeeter to write for black people. Why is that a problem? It is a problem because there is a difference between speaking for others, speaking about others, and speaking with others. So there was in the civil rights movement a large group of people of color who were fighting racism. And there were, in a smaller number, some white people who joined that fight and followed the leadership of those people of color against racism. That is speaking with others. But that's not the case in the movie. In this movie, black people ask Skeeter to speak for them instead of speaking with them, right? Another subtle message is that the character Minnie has a lot of children. One of her children are a 14-year-old daughter called Sugar, and Sugar becomes a maid as well. It's very important to note that the same black people who used to be slaves, they were the ones who became maids, who became waiters, who became miners, who worked in meat factories and other degrading jobs. So there is a continuation between this profession of maids and slavery, right? The same women who used to work as maids in their owner's household, now their daughters are maids in those same white households, right? Now, Minnie's daughter, Sugar, becomes a maid, and Minnie says to her daughter, "No sass mouthing, I mean it." It means you should not be a sassy black girl. You should not fight your white bosses, no matter how racist they are. Is Minnie happy with this situation? In the end of the movie, Minnie is fired by her racist boss, and then she's hired by a good white family. And then in the end of the movie, she's super happy with the situation in which she will spend the rest of her life as a maid in a white household, while her 14-year-old daughter is still a maid in a white household. Why is she happy about it? That's the question. Another question that we should ask ourselves is, remember that in the end of the movie, Abilene is walking towards a shiny horizon. Where is she going? So in the movie, we just assume that she will have a better life by leaving a racist household. But this is the 1960s. She has nowhere else to go, and she has no other profession to pursue. She cannot just choose to become a journalist. She cannot just choose to become a doctor, right? There aren't many options for her other than being a maid in another white household. So if she is in the south of the United States at that period of time, I don't think that she's going towards a very shiny horizon at all. So those are messages that are really not obvious to people who haven't developed media literacy yet. You need critical thinking skills to notice those messages that the authors did not want to convey. The moment or practice 2 is called identity. In this part, you need to pay attention to race, class, gender, sexuality, age, disability, and other identities. Ask yourself, what are the identities of the people who are represented? The characters in a novel, the people in a photograph collection, the actors in a movie, etc. And what systemic oppressions based on identity are involved? Racism, classism, sexism, cis-heterosexism, ageism, ableism, lookism, sizeism, and so on. Here you can see an example from the movie Exodus, Gods and Kings from 2014, directed by Ridley Scott. Here there is a comparison between this movie and an animation about the life of Moses. In the animation, Moses' story is led by characters of color. So Moses was a person who lived in the Middle East much before Christ. So of course that he would be considered today a person of color. He almost certainly had brown skin, very dark skin, right? Now, in the animation, characters had darker skin. However, in Ridley Scott's movie, the actors who played those same characters were white. And so their faces were darkened, their skin was darkened in order to play Middle Eastern characters. And that is a problem because of the history of blackface and minstrelsy in the United States of America, in which white people would pretend to be people of color to make fun of them, right? And that is also a problem because today people of color have a very hard time succeeding in the movie industry. So it would be very important to give up the opportunity for actors of color to play characters of color. Now, going back to the analysis of the movie The Help, how does identity appear in this movie? Well, Skeeter is white, slim, young, pretty, and a journalist, right? So how can this woman who has a lot of privileges stand for women, right? When this story was supposed to be about the relationship between white women and black women, but are black women really as strongly represented, and are their voices as strongly represented as the voices of white women in this story? It's very important to realize that Skeeter is Catherine Stockett's alter ego. Catherine Stockett was the writer of the book on which the movie was based. And one evidence that Skeeter is the alter ego of Stockett is that the author's daughter Lila plays young Skeeter in the movie, right? So one very famous scene is when the other maid that used to work for the household where Skeeter lives used to say to this little girl, "You is kind, you is smart, you is important." And this little girl is in real life the writer's daughter. Another question is, black characters arrested development. Who are they? Who are those black people? What do they do when white people are not around? The lives of these black women only revolve around the lives of white people. We don't know who they are and how they interact in the world as black women without taking into consideration how they interact with white women. It is as if their very existence only matters if they are around white people, which means that white characters are very much developed in the storyline, but the stories of these black characters are not developed at all. So the question is, how does it feel to be a black woman in the 1960s raising white children? Did we hear black women's voices in this movie? Not really. right? So even though supposedly we are assumed to be learning about the stories of black women who worked as maids in white households in the 1960s, the truth is the only voices that we hear are the voices and the perspectives or viewpoints of white people about black women. Here to the right, you can see the photo of Ebeline Cooper. Ebeline Cooper was the woman whose life was used as inspiration for Catherine Stockett to write her bestseller. And she was very, very upset about this book because Catherine Stockett only saw her twice and never talked to her, just observed her very attentively, and without Ebeline Cooper's permission, wrote an entire book based on her life. And she heard the story of her life from other white people, not from Ebeline Cooper. So the life of Ebeline Cooper was used by Catherine Stockett, and Catherine Stockett got a lot of money out of it, right? Millions of dollars, and none of this money went to the pockets of the black women on which the book was based. So if you want to learn more about this, I suggest that you read a news article called "Her Family Hired Me as a Maid for 12 Years, but then she stole my life and made it a Disney movie." The moment or practice 3 is called production. In production, you have to find out when and where the cultural artifact was released, in which year, in which country, etc., and by which companies. Also, you have to ask who has made the cultural artifact. What are the identities of the people who made this cultural artifact? For example, what is the production company? Who are the CEOs of those production companies? Who are the creators, such as the scriptwriter, the songwriter, the photographer, etc.? Who is the director of the movie? Who is the producer of the television series? Who is the influencer on the YouTube channel? Who is the journalist who wrote the news article? And so on. Also ask, how was the production of the cultural artifact embedded in power relations, on systemic oppressions, on resistance to oppression? Here you can see the photo of Shonda Rhimes. Shonda Rhimes is one of the very few African American women who direct well-sponsored television series. This is important because if only white, wealthy men produce, write, direct television series and television programs, probably the messages in those cultural artifacts will be biased in terms of racism, classism, sexism, and so on. There should be more opportunities for people from marginalized groups to succeed in those media industries. Going back to the analysis of The Help, this movie was released in 2011. It was directed by Tate Taylor. It was produced by Chris Columbus, Michael Barnathan, Bronson Green. The screenplay was also by Tate Taylor. It was based on a book called The Help by Catherine Stockett. The production companies were DreamWorks Pictures, Reliance Entertainment, Participant Media, Image Nation, 1492 Pictures, This is very interesting because 1492 was the time when Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas and started the genocide and colonization of indigenous people. And Harbinger Pictures. It was distributed by Walt Disney Studios and Motion Pictures. Let's remember that Walt Disney Studios is one of the big six, and therefore contributes to media consolidation. Now, when you look at the photos of the director of the movie, the producers, the CEOs of these companies, and so on, and the writer of the book, what do they all have in common? Is it a coincidence that they are white? Is it a coincidence that they are middle or higher class? Is it a coincidence that most of them are men? Is it a coincidence that they are cisgender? So you can see here that even though this movie was supposed to be anti-racist and respect the perspectives and voices of Black people, the entire narrative comes from the perspectives of white people. And most of them are white men from wealthy families. How could they know the perspectives of Black women working as maids in the 1960s without actually talking to them and respecting their viewpoints about racism, sexism, classism, and other systemic oppressions that they had to go through? The moment or practice 4 is called consumption. In this part, you will have to ask yourself, how did the public receive this cultural artifact? Did audiences like it or dislike it? Why? And what were their reactions? What did they post on websites? What did they say on social media about this cultural artifact? What did they do in order to show their content or discontent towards the movie or the book or the animation or any other cultural artifact? So here in this photo, you can see indigenous people who are protesting sports mascots that are reinforcing stereotypes about indigenous people. Then this photo comes from an article called "Protest Planned Against Redskins Before Season Opener in Arizona." So the problem is that in the United States of America, there are many sports teams that use mascots that are racist. Many of them represent some racial minorities or even groups that used to be racialized but are not anymore. For example, 100 years ago, the Irish immigrants in the United States of America used to be racialized and not considered fully white like Anglo-Saxons were. So there are stereotypes about Irish people, and there are sports mascots that are based on those stereotypes. Similarly, there are many different mascots that have been created. Some of them have already been banned, that are based on racially marginalized groups. So indigenous people have been fighting very strongly against those stereotypes and against those mascots because they are based on colonial language. Now, going back to the analysis of The Help, let's see how audiences have interpreted this movie. Now, this movie was super popular and still is. You can see that on IMDb, it receives 8.1 stars out of 10. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has 76% fresh tomatoes, and it has an 89% of approval from audiences. But does it mean that everybody was happy about this movie? Now, The Help earned a lot of money in the Hollywood industry, both in the USA and around the world. So most white audiences really loved this movie and thought that it faithfully portrayed relationships between white women and black women. However, black audiences were not as happy. In fact, the actress who played Abeline, Viola Davis, she today regrets having played this character in the movie. Today, Viola Davis is the actress who plays the protagonist of a television series called How to Get Away with Murder, in which she is a very powerful black woman. But in the movie, she realized that the voices of black women were not heard at all. The perspectives were all from white people, and that is very problematic in a movie that pretends or intends to be anti-racist. So it's very important for you to pay attention to different opinions and interpretations of the cultural artifact that you are analyzing, both in favor and against. And the last moment or practice is regulation. In regulation, you have to focus on power relations in all the moments of this cultural artifact, in representation, identity, production, and consumption. When you are analyzing the cultural artifact from all these moments, you always have to center on systemic oppressions and resistance to oppression. So some systemic oppressions based on identity would be racism, classism, sexism, and so on. There are other systemic oppressions involved as well, such as neoliberal capitalism, media consolidation, militainment, and so on. Also pay attention to those systemic oppressions. Pay attention to cases of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination in the cultural artifact that you are analyzing. And pay attention to what people have done to fight systemic oppressions through this cultural artifact or by fighting messages that are violent against marginalized groups from the audiences, right? And other groups. Here I am showing several examples of movies that supposedly are anti-racist, but in fact, in many different ways, reinforce racism. Those are Green Book, Hidden Figures, The Upside, and The Butler. And of course, there are hundreds more, but these are just some very recent examples. And now that you know how to apply representation analysis, please choose a cultural artifact that you are passionate about and apply the 5 moments or practices of Stuart Hall's Circuit of Culture. Don't forget to consult your professor. These are the references. All right, everybody, if you have any questions or comments, please send me an email or post comments below. Thank you.